As Latham and Ashley discussed the things they wanted their daughter to learn, Norman and Sydney arrived. Brock waved at Norman, gesturing for him to join their team in the basketball game, but Jonathan had beat him to it. He grabbed Norman's arm and dragged him over to his team. The sun beat down on the court, and the players were feeling hot and tired. Henry and Jacob, who were the youngest on the teams, were the least bothered by the heat and the most active. They dribbled the ball with ease and threw hoops as if their lives depended on it. The teams were tied with 2 minutes remaining in the second half of the game. Jacob passed the ball to Henry, who then passed it to Eduardo. The latter lifted the ball and successfully shot it through the hoop, winning 2 points for their team. Norman was next to dribble the ball, and he threw it to Jonathan, who was blocked by Brock as he aimed the ball at the hoop. But Jonathan's footwork was exceptional, and he quickly dodged him. Eduardo followed him while signaling to his other team members to keep an eye out. Jonathan ran toward the hoop as if he wanted to take a shot, but he caught everyone off guard by passing the ball to Emma at the last minute. Emma then made a beautiful shot, scoring 3 points. Latham, who was the referee, blew the whistle, signaling the end of the game. Jonathan's team had won by 3 points. Though it was just a friendly match, tensions had been high, and everyone seemed incredibly excited. The players walked off the court, wiping the sweat from their faces. Nancy waved her phone at them. "Come on, guys, let me take a picture of everyone." They stood in 2 rows as she snapped a photo of them. Henry noticed Katie, who was busy planting a kiss on Rebecca's head, and then he smiled at her. "Be careful. Jonathan scolded me for kissing her in the hospital after they had just been born. He said I might give her germs." She laughed as she looked at his dirty, sweaty face. "I'm not surprised. Just look at you and Jacob. You look like you've been working at a filthy construction site. The others aren't half as grimy and disgusting as you two." Henry turned red with embarrassment, and he and Jacob went inside to wash their faces. They returned to the garden a few minutes later. "How's this? Better?" Henry asked Katie. She nodded. "Much better. But I see that despite all your efforts on the basketball court, my uncle's team still won by 3 points." Henry was outraged. His team had stronger players. It wasn't fair. "Come on. Everyone knows Eduardo's the best. He was on your team." Henry raised his eyebrows. "Really? Since you seem to know so much about sports, how about a game of tennis? We'll play doubles. Jacob and me against you and another player." "Is that a challenge?" Jacob laughed. "It is. Choose your partner and let's meet on the court in a few minutes. I'll get the rackets and some tennis balls." "Okay, it's a deal." She turned around and scanned the garden for someone to play with. Since she was up against 2 males, she knew she had to find someone who was strong and skilled. Jonathan noticed her looking around, so he went up to her. "What's up, Katie? Who are you looking for?" "Jacob and Henry challenged me to a game of tennis, and I need a partner. Do you know any good tennis players here?" Just then, her eyes fell on Emma. She quickly approached her with a huge smile on her face. "Hi, how's it going? Do you want to play tennis with me, Henry and Jacob? I need a partner." Emma frowned. "Sorry, Katie, but I'm beat after playing basketball. I just want to relax and have a drink. Maybe later, okay?" She could see the disappointment on her face, but she had already made it clear to Katie in Boston that she wanted to be left alone. Just as Katie was about to look for someone else, Peter volunteered. "Hey, I'll be your partner." She clapped her hands excitedly. "Wow, thanks, Peter." He tousled her hair playfully. "Come on, let's go show those two how the game is played." They walked to the tennis court. Professor Benedict, who had also been invited to the party, was impressed by Peter. "Those young people have so much energy. I don't know how they do it. He just spent an hour running around the basketball court." Anissa laughed. "I think it's pent-up energy. He's got a new girlfriend, but she went back to Houston a few days ago for her studies, so he's been spending his nights alone in his apartment." Nancy overheard them talking. "Is Peter seeing someone? I wasn't aware. What's her name?" Mark, who was standing nearby, joined the conversation. Haven't you seen his social handles lately? They're full of pictures of her. It's like he's got nothing better to do than brag about her all the time. Nancy was surprised. Really? To be honest, I barely have time to go to the bathroom these days, let alone spend time on social media. She took out her phone to check Peter's social media profile. I see his girlfriend studying medicine. Wow, he even uploaded a picture of her in a white coat. Where did they meet? She doesn't seem like his type at all. I wonder how serious it is, Anissa remarked. You never know with him. He dates a lot of women. Helga passed by just then, and she glanced over Nancy's shoulder to see what she was looking at. Oh my goodness, I know that girl. That's Sheena Brooks. Nancy stared at her. Really? How do you know about her? She's from Houston. Her father's a doctor. As far as I know, she's also studying medicine. Nancy was thoughtful. Peter was in the hospital a few months ago. I wonder if that's where he met her. Perhaps she's an intern. Well, it looks like almost everyone in our group has finally found someone. Katie, Peter, Jacob, and Henry were playing an intense game of tennis on the court. Katie couldn't remember the last time she had sweat so much, but she was loving every minute of it. She glanced around nervously occasionally to see if Emma was watching her, but no one was there. Everyone was busy drinking and mingling in the garden. She swiped the sweat from her face and focused on the ball. As she put her heart and soul into the game, she soon forgot about Emma. She and Peter made a great team, and they were already ahead by several points. Emma had changed out of her sweaty clothes and was sitting on the grass in the corner of the garden, thinking about her father. She had gone back to Boston several times to visit his grave when she knew her mother wouldn't be there. Dorothy still refused to accept her apology, no matter how much she had begged or pleaded. She had left her mother a set of spare keys to her apartment in New York, hoping she would come to her senses and visit her. But so far, she hadn't gone to see her even once. Emma knew Maya's friends and family were still angry at her by the looks they gave her whenever she went to Boston. The basketball game had been one of the most fun moments she had had since her father's passing. Focusing on throwing the ball through the hoop and scoring points had taken her mind off her worries, if only momentarily. She realized she needed to get out of the apartment and engage in activities more often. She also wondered whether her feelings of hopelessness and despair would ever vanish. Just then, she heard shouts from the tennis court, and she looked over to see what was going on. Katie was lying on the ground, and Peter, Jacob, and Henry were busy tending to her. She had tripped and scraped her leg while running to hit the tennis ball. Jacob examined her injury. It's just a scratch, but I'll go get the medical kit. He ran into the house and returned a minute later. He then squatted next to Katie, and he carefully cleaned her wound with disinfectant. Henry was impressed. Where did you learn to do that? Jacob shrugged. It's no big deal. I've dealt with cuts and scrapes before. He looked at Katie, who was wincing with pain. Just bear with me. I'm almost done. She nodded, trying hard not to cry in front of them. Although Jacob was careful, the disinfectant stung. He quickly finished cleaning the wound, and then he patched her up. There you go. It should be okay in a few days. Just be careful not to get it wet when you take a shower, and change the bandage regularly. Once the scab forms, the skin underneath will start to heal. She nodded, looking at him gratefully. Thanks, Jacob. I appreciate it. I don't know how I managed to trip and fall. She liked him. They weren't related, but she considered him part of the family because she was Maria's younger brother. Jacob closed the medical kit. Do you need help walking? They helped her off the ground. She found that she could stand, but walking was painful. Henry was just about to offer his help when Jacob beat him to it. He lifted her off the ground and took quick strides toward the garden. Katie instinctively wrapped her arms around his neck. She looked admiringly at him. Despite his thin figure and lankiness, he was quite strong. She noticed that he didn't smell of sweat, even though they had played an intense game of tennis. It was the first time anyone had picked her up and carried her like that, and she enjoyed it. even if she felt slightly awkward. She saw that Emma was watching them, and she hoped she wouldn't get the wrong impression. Ever since she had returned from her trip to Boston, Katie had given a lot of thought to what Emma had said. She had tried her best to avoid her during the past several months, but her feelings for her were as strong as ever. She hadn't seen Emma for a while, and every time she felt sad or lonely, she would picture her face and wonder when they would bump into each other again. Sometimes she would check out her social media handles and find out what she was up to, but she didn't dare send her a message. Katie realized that no matter how hard she tried to bury her feelings, they resurfaced each time she saw Emma or thought about her. She would have a place in her heart for the foreseeable future. She told herself to forget about Emma for the day and focus on having a good time. Jacob carefully put her down on the lawn and then went to get her a bottle of water. Henry, who had followed behind them with the medical kit, smiled at Katie when he saw she was feeling better. "So what's the score? I lost count." Peter winked at him. "Katie and I won by 2 points. "Impossible! You missed the last ball. You dropped your racket when Katie fell, remember?" "Whatever. Let's just say we tied. I'm not going to get into an argument with you. How about I make us some burgers?" Nancy overheard him, and she decided to tease him. "Do you know how to grill, Peter? Your burgers won't be as good as Helga's." Peter laughed. "Just wait until you see my amazing barbecue skills. I'm good at everything I put my mind to." Relieved that Katie had found some friends to hang out with for the rest of the day, Sophia went up to Nancy. "Tristan just woke up, and he won't stop crying. I think he may be hungry." Nancy rolled her eyes as she got up. "Here we go again. Thanks. I'll go feed him." Esther jumped up and followed her into the house. "Do you mind if I watch you breastfeed? I want to see how a professional does it." Nancy laughed. "Of course I don't mind. You'll be breastfeeding in a few weeks, too." They went up to Tristan's room, and Nancy took him out of his crib. She then sat in an armchair, lifted her shirt, and began to breastfeed him. Esther watched her with great curiosity. "Did you ever think we'd become mothers one day? It seems like just yesterday we were 2 girls doing crazy things. Sometimes I think I never really grew up, and I wish I could go back to those days when everything was so uncomplicated." Nancy sighed. "Yes, things were much easier when we were younger." She recalled how innocent she had been before she had gotten engaged to Stark. She had never worried about getting married and having kids back then, let alone breastfeeding 3 newborns. She marveled at how much her life had changed. She looked up at her friend. "Have you decided on names yet for your sons?" Esther didn't reply. She was touching her stomach, looking anxious. Nancy was concerned. "Esther, is something wrong?" When Esther still didn't respond, Nancy became nervous. "Talk to me. Is it the babies? Are you in pain?" Esther took a deep breath. "It feels like I'm having contractions, but I'm not sure. Something's wrong." She grabbed onto the back of the chair to steady herself. Her water broke just as Sophia entered the room. Sophia rushed over to her. "Oh my goodness, it's time. Sit down and try to relax while I get Xavier." Esther groaned. "I can't believe this. Today of all days. Now I'll have to go to the hospital. Don't think I'm ready for this. Maybe I should lie down." "Don't worry. Everything's going to be fine," Nancy assured her. "Your obstetrician will examine you in no time." "But how can I be having contractions so soon?" "It happens. You're only a few weeks away from your due date, so it's not premature. I guess your babies are eager to come out. You and Xavier are going to have beautiful, healthy boys." Esther nodded. "Yeah, I've read all the baby books, and I know many women give birth before their due date. Still, I can't help feeling something's wrong." She looked down at her dress. "Look at this. I'm soaking wet. I'm so sorry about the floor." "Don't worry. Remember, I've already been through this." When Sophia told Xavier that his wife was in labor, he ran up the stairs, 2 steps at a time. When Nancy heard his footsteps on the landing, She quickly pulled her shirt over her breasts. Xavier rushed into the room, looking incredibly agitated. "Honey, did your water break? Let's get you to the hospital as soon as possible." He helped Esther down the stairs and into the hallway, where Jonathan and Peter were already waiting for them. Jonathan instructed his driver to take them to the hospital. He didn't want to leave Nancy's side, so he asked Jack and Mavis to accompany them. Xavier and Peter helped Esther to the car, and then they jumped in beside her. After Nancy made Jack promise to call her as soon as they knew something, he and Mavis got into their car and they drove away. Nancy waved them off, and then she asked Sophia to help her take the triplets outside to the garden. They were particularly restless that day, and they kicked their feet in the air and looked around excitedly. Katie sat next to their strollers, holding their tiny fists and kissing the top of their little heads. Jacob and Henry made faces at the babies, trying to coax a smile out of them. The housekeeper brought out the dishes, and everyone gathered around the large patio table to eat. They drank wine, chatted, and laughed, enjoying the festive atmosphere. Esther, Xavier, Jack, Mavis, and Peter arrived at the hospital a half-hour later, and a nurse quickly wheeled Esther into an examination room for an ultrasound. The obstetrician appeared a moment later. Xavier looked nervously at him as he examined his wife. The doctor cleared his throat. "It looks like your twins are ready to come out. However, I see that your placenta is covering the opening of the cervix, so I would suggest a C-section to be on the safe side." Xavier turned to Esther. "Let's do what the doctor says, honey. It's less risky this way." Esther nodded, though she had been hoping for a natural birth. "I don't have a choice, do I? Okay, let's get this over with." They wheeled her into the operating room, and Xavier waited outside with the others. Every minute was pure torture for him, and he paced up and down the corridor anxiously. Peter patted him on the shoulder. "Relax, man. Your wife is in good hands. Everything's going to be just fine." Xavier nodded absent-mindedly, but he wasn't convinced. Jack texted Nancy with the news that Xavier was having a C-section. Esther was given an injection, so she didn't feel any pain as the doctor performed the surgery. She gradually relaxed and waited for the babies to be taken out. A few minutes later, she heard the sound of crying, and her heart overflowed with joy. The obstetrician smiled at her. "Congratulations, you have your first boy." She breathed a sigh of relief. Not long after, the second baby arrived, and he cried even louder. "And here's his little brother. They're both healthy boys," the doctor announced. Two nurses wiped the twins and wrapped them in blankets as the doctor stitched Esther up. Once the procedure was complete, the nurses gave Esther the babies to hold for a while before taking them out to the waiting area to meet their father. Xavier rushed up to them as soon as he saw them. "Congratulations, Mr. Sloan," one of the nurses said. "Say hello to your two sons." "Thank you. How's my wife?" "She's doing just fine. Everything went smoothly. The doctor's just finishing up, so you can see her soon." Xavier breathed a sigh of relief. His eyes filled with tears as he looked at his tiny bundles of joy. The nurse smiled at him. "We need to take them back now for their measurements and vitamin shots. You'll see them again later." "Okay, thank you." He waited impatiently for Esther. The door finally opened to the operating room 10 minutes later, and she was wheeled out. She burst into tears when she saw her husband. "I was so nervous, but everything went well. We have two wonderful sons, my love." He nodded, wiping away his tears. He took her hand. "I know. I saw them a few minutes ago. They're so beautiful. You can't imagine how happy I am." Soon after Esther had settled in her room, the nurses brought the twins in. One slept while the other cried. Jack took out his phone, snapping pictures like a professional photographer. Then, he uploaded some pictures to the group chat. Everyone was still sitting at the table on the patio when they received notifications on their phones. Hannah looked at the pictures Jack had sent with dismay. It was the second time in less than 2 months that one of her friends had had babies. but she vowed not to let it get to her this time. Back at the hospital, the painkillers Esther had been given were beginning to wear off, and she felt weak. She closed her eyes and promptly fell asleep. Xavier sat by her side, watching her and holding her hand. The nurses told him that she wasn't ready to breastfeed yet, so they gave him a bottle of formula to feed his sons. When Esther woke up a while later, she was surprised to see him holding and feeding one of the babies. She laughed softly. He glanced up at her. "Hey, you're awake. How are you feeling?" "A bit weak. I'm also hungry. I'll go get some food as soon as I finish feeding him." She stretched out her arms. "That's okay. I can take over now." Xavier handed their son to Esther and then went down to the cafeteria. He returned a few minutes later with some soup and crackers. After eating a few spoonfuls, Esther grabbed her phone and sent a message to their group of friends. She also sent a separate message and a photo of her sons to Oliver. Oliver read the message Esther had sent. "I'm pleased to announce the arrival of our two little princes, Beau and Luke. Both boys are happy and healthy. They came a bit earlier than planned, but Mommy and Daddy are thrilled. Hope you're well, and I can't wait for you to meet our sons." He looked at the picture accompanying the message, and he broke into a huge smile. "Reggie has two cousins," he thought. "If only my daughter was with us too." The men had been searching the area where Gavin had pulled Zoe and Layla off the cliff 2 months ago, but except for a few pieces of torn clothing, they had found no traces of them. They had even traveled up and down the river, sending divers down to the bottom of the riverbed, but without luck. He found it hard to believe that 2 adults and a baby could just disappear off the face of the earth, but he knew he had to come to terms with the very real possibility that they were dead. He pushed the horrible thought aside, and he replied to Esther's message. "Congratulations. What wonderful news. I'm also a father now. My son's name is Reginald, or Reggie for short. Sorry for waiting so long to tell you, but I suppose now's as good a time as any." He also sent her a picture that he had recently taken of his son. He was already 2 months old, and he was becoming more adorable with each passing day. He had a beautiful smile, and he was easy to handle most of the time. As soon as Oliver finished texting Esther, he heard the sound of crying in the next room. He put his phone away and rushed over to Reggie's crib. His child had woken up, and he had a wet diaper. Leah was about to pick him up when Oliver put his hand on her arm. "It's okay. I can change him." He picked up a toy and waved it in front of Reggie, who stopped crying and smiled at him. Leah laughed. "Isn't he the sweetest thing you've ever seen?" Oliver leaned over and kissed the top of his son's head. "Reggie, you have 2 cousins now, both boys. I'll take you to see them when you're a bit older." Reggie looked up at him and gurgled happily. Oliver thought about Layla again, wondering whether she was alive and where she was. He had always wanted a girl. Leah handed him a diaper, and he carefully lifted Reggie out of his crib and put him on the changing table. He had been observing Leah for 2 months, and he had learned how to do many things. He skillfully removed the dirty diaper, wiped Reggie's tushy clean, and put a fresh diaper on him. He then picked him up and rocked him back and forth. Hundreds of miles away in a small village, Zoe had just finished feeding Layla and putting her down to sleep. She went out of the hut to take a walk along the street. It was a beautiful sunny day, and she bumped into one of her elderly neighbors. The man smiled when he saw her. "Hello. What are you doing outside? Your mother said that you are still weak. I was just coming to see you. Look, I picked some fruits and vegetables from my garden, and I stopped by the butcher's to get you some meat." He showed her the basket he was carrying. She looked at him gratefully. "Thank you so much. It's very kind of you. How much do I owe you?" She took some cash out of her pocket. The man held up his hand. "There's no need for that much. The fruits and vegetables are free, but you can give me a few dollars for the meat." She nodded, counted the money, and gave it to him. After chatting with him for a while, she took the basket and returned to the hut. Layla was still sleeping soundly in her crib. Zoe leaned over her, whispering, "We're going to have a good meal today." She sighed and sat down on a beat-up old couch in the small sitting room, thinking back to the day Gavin had jumped off the cliff, pulling her and Layla with him. Thankfully, they had landed in the river. She had lost her grip on Layla when they had fallen, but she had quickly swum over to her and saved her before she had drowned. The river had been freezing cold, however, and she had struggled to keep herself and her baby above water. The strong current had carried them away, and then they had hit a rock. The next thing she remembered was coming to shore and seeing a middle-aged woman holding Layla in her arms. The woman had explained that she had spotted them and had pulled them out of the water. She had then invited Zoe back to her hut so she could change into dry clothes and get something to eat. Zoe later found out that her name was Josephine, and that both her husband, who had been a fisherman, and her daughter had passed away years ago. She had been living on her own in a nearby village for several years, and she often went down to the river to fish. It was on one of those days that she had seen Zoe and her baby in the water. Zoe was grateful for Josephine's kindness, though she thought she was slightly crazy. She assumed it was because of the trauma she had suffered. Josephine had started calling Zoe her daughter, and she considered Layla to be her grandchild. Her real daughter had run away when she had been just a teenager, had gotten married a few years later, and, after being abandoned by her husband, had been on her way back to her mother's village when she had been killed in an accident. When Josephine had found out, she hadn't told anyone about it. Part of her still refused to accept her daughter's death, and she would often stare out the window, waiting for her to return. It happened such a long time ago that no one in the village remembered what the girl had looked like, and they assumed Zoe was Josephine's long-lost daughter. So, when Oliver's men had appeared looking for Zoe and Layla, none of the villagers had known anything. Zoe had run a high fever for several days after being pulled out of the river, and she had become delirious. She had lain in the small, rickety bed in Josephine's room, unable to move. She had thought she was going to die, but knowing Layla was there beside her had made her fight to stay alive. There were no doctors or medicine in the village, so it had taken her some time to recover. After a few weeks, she had felt well enough to get out of bed and move around. She had gradually gotten to know everyone in the village and had even asked about Gavin, but no one had seen him. Josephine was very kind to her, so Zoe decided to stay until she was sure Gavin and Oliver no longer posed a threat to her and her baby. They lived a simple life, and they ate a diet of potatoes, rice, and vegetables on most days, except when Josephine went down to the river to catch fish. Zoe was grateful she had enough breast milk, so luckily, Layla didn't go hungry either. After staying in Havana, Zoe felt strange living in a tiny village that was completely cut off from the rest of the world. There was no internet access, and no one had a smartphone. Very few households owned a television set. People lived off the land, growing fruits and vegetables in their gardens and going down to the river to fish. There was only one small grocery store and a butcher. One afternoon, Josephine returned after fishing down by the river. She decided to make fish soup for dinner, hoping Zoe would eat heartily and gain some weight. Zoe watched her stir the contents of the big pot, and she reached out for the wooden spoon. "Here, let me do that." Josephine shook her head. "No, you should get some rest. You're so weak." Just then, Layla started crying in the next room, and Zoe rushed over to comfort her. She leaned over her crib and picked her up. She noticed that she had pooped in her cloth diaper, so she cleaned her and put a fresh diaper on her. Josephine went into the room a minute later, picked up the dirty diaper, and took it outside to wash. Zoe was touched. The woman was slightly mad, but she took care of her and Layla as if they were family. She marveled at how kind everyone was in the village, though she rarely ventured outside the hut because she was constantly afraid that she would run into Gavin or Oliver. She had been having nightmares ever since Gavin had kidnapped her, and she didn't want to risk her life or Layla's life ever again. Her only hope was that Oliver would keep his promise to take care of her sick mother and ensure her family had enough money for food and clothing. She still hadn't fully recovered from her ordeal, so she decided to stay in the village for as long as she could. Zoe sometimes wondered what the future held in store for her, but until she was done breastfeeding her daughter, she wouldn't take any unnecessary risks. They were safe and happy with Josephine for the time being. She laid Layla back in her crib, and then she went into the kitchen to stir the pot of soup. Smoke rose from the chimney, and all was peaceful and quiet in the tiny village in the middle of nowhere. The garden party was still in full swing at the Davis Villa. Nancy read Jack's message out loud to the group of friends gathered around the table. Mavis, Peter, and I are still at the hospital with Esther and Xavier. We've been discussing names for the twins. After much debate, the parents decided on Beau, which means handsome in French for the eldest, and the other boy's name is Luke, named after Xavier's favorite Star Wars character. Stay tuned. Everyone laughed. What lovely names, Sydney exclaimed. I want Xavier to help me name our baby too. Nancy smiled. Jonathan and I can help you. We've decided to start a baby naming business now that everyone's pregnant. We're charging $100 a name, but friends get a 20% discount. The group burst out laughing again. Norman waved his phone at her. Okay, I'll wire you some money now. Give me your account number. Latham raised his eyebrows. Why are you in such a hurry? Norman winked at Sydney, who turned red with embarrassment. We recently found out that we're expecting. Ashley clapped her hands excitedly. This is so great! You're only a few months behind me. Our kids will be best friends. She then posted the good news to the group chat so Esther and Xavier would see. Norman and Sydney just told us they're having a baby. Isn't that wonderful? Esther was lying in her hospital bed with her eyes closed when she received a notification on her phone. The doctor had just given her another painkiller, so she was feeling drowsy. She grabbed her phone from the bedside table and read Ashley's message. Xavier, did you see this? Another baby's on the way. What are the odds? She quickly typed a message. Congrats to Norman and Sydney. I hope it's a girl to balance things out, but I'm thrilled either way. After she sent it, Xavier took the phone away from her. Come on, can't you ignore all this silliness for once? This is the happiest day of our lives. We should be celebrating the birth of our sons. She pouted. But it's fun, and I'm feeling a lot better. Besides, the babies are asleep. The group chat was soon flooded with other messages. Jack was the second to respond after Esther. Norman, why do you always have to beat me to it? Nancy laughed and typed her message. What are you and Mavis waiting for? And what about Helga and Steve? They haven't made an announcement yet. Mavis just graduated last year. We want to wait a few years before having kids. Jack replied. I also graduated not long ago. Are you suggesting we had kids too early? Nancy wrote. Jonathan winked at her. Maybe we should just give our triplets away. Ashley stuck her tongue out at Jack. It sounds like you're making fun of us pregnant women. Mavis shook her head. That wasn't his intention. We just want to get to know each other a bit and enjoy life before we have kids. Peter laughed. I'll drink to that. I don't know why everyone is in such a rush to have babies. I'm loving my freedom. Ashley frowned. What about the girl you're dating? Don't you intend to marry her eventually? There's no hurry. After Sheena graduates from med school, she'll have to do her internship. They chatted animately until Helga finally gathered the courage to tell them that she and Steve had decided to start a family. Nancy was thrilled. That's great news. I can't wait to be great aunt. Does that make me sound old? Helga laughed. A little bit. Steve nudged Helga and whispered, Let's get going before they start teasing us again. Just then, Sydney asked Helga to examine her to find out whether she was having a boy or a girl. After Helga told her there was a strong possibility it would be a boy, Sydney sent a message in the group chat. Nancy burst out laughing. Everyone's having boys. They'll be fighting over Rebecca and Ashley and Latham's daughter. Esther was discharged from the hospital a few days later, and Nancy, Jonathan, and Harold went over to her house to introduce the triplets to the twins. 2 months later, Helga was at home reading a book. Latham had just left after his treatment, and Helga was waiting for Steve to return from a week-long business trip. She smiled when she heard the key turning in the lock. She jumped up, ran to the hallway, and threw her arms around her husband's neck. "I'm so glad you're home. I missed you." She could tell he was exhausted. He was working harder than ever, and he barely took time off to rest. He buried his face in her hair. "It's good to be back. I missed you too." He then lifted her and carried her over to the couch, kissing her passionately. He was just about to remove her top when she stopped him. "Steve, I have to tell you something." He pulled away, slightly frustrated. They hadn't seen each other for a week, and he had been waiting for that moment all day. "Why don't you tell me later?" "Because it's important. I'm pregnant." Steve was stunned. "You mean I'm going to be a father?" When Helga closed her eyes and didn't answer, he suddenly realized that she had passed out. Steve knew that Helga was prone to fainting once in a while, but at that moment, it felt different, and it worried him. She had just told him that she was pregnant, and he hoped she hadn't fainted because of some problem. His initial joy of the news was quickly replaced by worry. He tried to remain calm, and he called the doctor to tell him he was bringing Helga. Then, he arranged for his driver to bring the car around, helped Helga into the car, and took her to the hospital. At the hospital, she was given the usual routine checkups, and because Steve mentioned that she was pregnant, they also conducted a blood test. Steve waited anxiously for the results, and when the doctor returned with them, he confirmed that Helga was indeed pregnant. "Everything seems to be perfectly normal," the doctor said. "Her heart rate is a little on the low side, and we're monitoring that, but there's no need to be concerned." Steve let out a huge sigh of relief. He didn't want to go home and leave her there alone, so he had her transferred to a private room, and he stayed the night. Deep in the night, he awoke and got up to hold her in his arms. Fear slowly surged in his heart. Helga had told him that she had been born with a tendency to faint. There was no cause, and there was no cure. It had always been something she had just had to deal with. At that time, he hadn't thought much of it, but things had changed, and he couldn't help feeling worried. She was his wife, and she was carrying his child. That made her the most important person in the world to him. He watched her as she slept, and hoped the fainting wouldn't become a common occurrence. He tried to get back to sleep, but his thoughts swirled in his mind, and he couldn't sleep. He hugged Helga tightly, afraid that she would never wake up. But the following morning, Helga woke up feeling perfectly normal. She looked around and found herself in an unfamiliar room. She could feel Steve's breath on the back of her neck and his arms around her body. And she realized where she was and figured out what had happened. She tried to turn around, and Steve, feeling her movements, released his tight hold on her. "Are you awake?" She turned to face him. His eyes were bloodshot, and they had dark circles around them. He looked as if he hadn't slept all night. "Hey, did you get any sleep?" She touched his cheeks gently. "Helga, you're pregnant." He realized that he sounded a little stern, so he cleared his throat and said more gently, "You fainted yesterday." She understood how worried he must have been, and she took his hand in hers. "I'm much better now." He nodded and smiled at her, hoping she wasn't just trying to comfort him. Then her eyes lit up. "I've just figured something out. My fainting episodes are becoming less frequent." "How so?" "Well, when I first met you, I was fainting pretty much once a month. Then they started to get more frequent. At one point, they were only 18 days apart. But since we got married, they're becoming less frequent again. It's been 37 days since the last one." "What are you saying?" "I checked my medical book, and although it doesn't mention anything specific, there are some conditions that can occur when there's an imbalance of chemicals and hormones in the body. Once these are balanced out, those chronic illnesses can gradually heal themselves." Steve considered what she was saying and thought he understood.
So what you're saying is that after we got married, the chemicals and hormones in your body became more balanced?
Yes, that's exactly it. Helga looked at him excitedly. It must have happened when we started trying for a baby. He swallowed. If it weren't for the fact that he was in a hospital, he would have made love to her there and then. But then, a thought occurred to him, and he frowned.
But now that you're pregnant, we won't be able to do it anymore. Won't that mean that the fainting episodes are likely to increase?
Helga shook her head. It doesn't work like that. We can still have sex. It won't hurt the baby, if that's what you're worried about. Although it might become a little challenging once I get big.
I guess you know more about these things than I do.
He still felt a little uncertain, but he was willing to take her word for it. She was a woman and a trained medical practitioner. She was in a much better position to know whether or not a fetus could be affected during sex.
I'll be careful.
He gazed at her, and he felt an intense wave of joy and love ripple through his body. He took her in his arms again.
I can't tell you how lucky I feel to have you in my life.
Later, as Helga recovered in bed, she posted her and Steve's exciting news on the group chat. It wasn't long before their friends began replying with messages of congratulations. Esther remarked playfully that it was good to hear that all their bits and pieces were in good working order. But neither Brock nor Hannah replied. Hannah had started to make headway with her freelance writing and had signed some media contracts. She specialized in writing about urban culture, and her workflow was increasing all the time, leaving her too busy to check her social media accounts and group chats. Similarly, Brock had been working hard to rebuild his business, and he was also busy every day. He was eager to ensure that Jonathan's investment got some significant returns, but he was also trying to save enough money as quickly as he could to buy back his villa. On the day that Helga announced her pregnancy, Brock and Austin had just finished a meeting when Brock received a phone call. The caller ID showed that it was from Brazil. He frowned at his phone. It was the first time he had received a call from Brazil since his father had disowned him. He ignored it and let it ring out. A moment later, Austin's phone rang. He hesitated and looked at his boss.
Should I answer it?
Brock thought for a moment, and then he nodded.
But tell them I'm not here.
Austin answered the call and heard a woman's voice come through the phone. Hello, this is Anna. Austin's heart leapt. Anna was Louis's lover and the mother of his youngest son, who was about 2 years old. Can you let Brock come to the phone? I have something to say to him.
I'm sorry, Anna. Brock's not here, and I'm too busy to talk right now. Goodbye.
Anna jumped in quickly before he could hang up. Louis has liver cancer. It's terminal. Again, Austin's heart leapt into his throat. Louis made it quite clear to Brock that he wanted no more to do with him. He's disinherited him, so this has nothing to do with him. He changed his mind. He's altered his will, and he wants Brock back in the family. Austin turned on the speaker so that Brock could listen to the conversation. Anna sounded as if she were choking back tears. Brock agreed to give up his share of the inheritance, so I'm hoping he's willing to keep his promise. Joe and I have nothing left. I'm begging Brock to help us by not claiming his inheritance. Realization dawned on Brock, and he understood why his father's mistress was calling him. Louis was dying, and Anna knew he would leave her and their 2-year-old son with nothing. Anna was still only in her late 20s, making her much younger than Louis. If Brock reclaimed his inherited rights and the wealth of the Obsidian Industries, his father would ensure she got nothing. That would probably force her to urgently find herself another wealthy man. She can't bear the thought of no longer living in the lap of luxury. Brock thought bitterly. And Joe's only a little kid. He'll do whatever his mother makes him do. Louis wasn't yet an old man. He had thought he still had another 20 years or so with his young son, so pushing Brock away hadn't been a big deal because he still had another son to inherit his wealth when the time came. He had had it all planned out, but his recent unexpected diagnosis had put a spanner in the works. The question is, if my father gives Anna nothing and she runs off with some other guy, how would my father cope with the idea of his little son taking another man's surname someday? He would turn in his grave. The more Brock thought about it, the
the more obvious it seemed that that was why his father had invited him back into the family. By giving his wealth and his business to his eldest son, he would be keeping it in the family and not risking it ending up in another man's pockets. Brock sneered at the idea. Anna was still on the phone, begging him to donate his inheritance to her. She was sure he could hear her. "If you don't do it, Brock, how can you call yourself a man? Louis is about to write you back into his will, so you must please stay away from him." She paused to let her words sink in. "I know you're there, Brock, and I know you can hear me. Your father and I have had a good relationship over the years, better than the one he had with your mother. He never loved her." Brock listened as she choked on her tears, and he scowled, knowing that they were probably fake tears. Her shameless behavior made him want to put an even greater distance between himself and his father. He decided it was time to let her know he had been listening to her. "Why have you really called me, Anna? Is it because you want the old man's money for yourself?" Anna was momentarily stunned. She had dared to believe that he had been listening, but it shocked her to actually hear his voice. She started to cry again. "Oh, Anna, don't worry," Brock said cynically. "I'll go back to Brazil and check on the old man's will. I want his money just as much as you do. I really don't give a crap about him, but thank you for telling me the news. I'll get Austin to book my ticket right away. See you soon." And with that, he hung up before she could say another word. Austin grinned. "That was awesome. That woman must be dying of anger right now." And then, he remembered what Anna had said about Louis, and he winced with regret. "I'm sorry, Brock. That was a terrible choice of words." Brock didn't respond. Instead, he walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and gazed out at the traffic below. Slowly, a malevolent smile spread across his lips as an idea formed in his head. He took out his phone and found the contact details of Louis and his assistant. Brock boarded a plane to Brazil 2 days later. Austin stayed in New York to manage the business. When Brock arrived at his childhood home, he found that nothing had changed. His father's chief bodyguard led him into the house, and he was greeted respectfully and humbly by all the servants. He stepped into a large, sumptuous living room and looked around. It had only been a few months since he had last seen his father, but it felt like years. And as his gaze rested on his father's face, he saw that he had aged. On the carpet in front of Louis, his illegitimate toddler son, Joe, was playing with his toys. Beside him, Anna was doing a good impression of a caring wife as she spooned medicine into his mouth. The bodyguard announced Brock's arrival, and the family of 3 all looked up at him. A frosty awkwardness filled the air. Louis sat up straight in his chair and cleared his throat. But since he and his elder son had become estranged, he couldn't think of anything to say, so he said nothing. Anna's face turned pale at the sight of Brock, but she pretended to be unperturbed and carried on giving Louis his medicine. Then, she picked her son up and went to stand beside Louis. "You're back," she said to Brock. "How lovely to see you. Sit down. Can I get you a drink?" Brock glanced at the woman and shook his head disdainfully. Who does she think she is? To him, she was just the latest one in a long line of women his father had seduced. The only thing that made her different from all the others was the fact that she had given birth to a son. He ignored her and sat down opposite his father. "Would you like to tell me why you called me back?" His tone was flat and emotionless, and it angered Louis. "What kind of attitude is that?" Louis's chest heaved up and down, and he looked as if he was going to launch himself at Brock. But Brock remained calm and refused to react. He stared at Louis as if he were challenging him to attack, but Louis didn't rise to it. Instead, he swallowed his pride and sank back in his chair. He stared at his son for several long seconds, and then he slowly got to his feet. "Follow me." Brock stood up and followed his brother toward the door. As he passed Anna, he noticed that her hands were tightly clenched into fists, and she was breathing heavily as if she were trying desperately to control her nerves. He gave her a cold smile, his eyes full of ridicule. He followed Louis up to the second floor and into the study. Louis closed the door. "I'm leaving these things to you." He pointed to a pile of documents on the desk. Brock leaned against the door, but he didn't look at the papers. He smiled sardonically. "You made it quite clear that your property has nothing to do with me. I even recall you saying that I wouldn't receive a single cent from you, and that you hoped I'd go to jail. So why have you asked me back now?" Louis didn't answer. He seemed to be concentrating all his efforts on controlling the anger that seethed inside him. Brock saw his opportunity to stick in the knife, and he went on. "It's because of that woman out there, isn't it? You're afraid she'll remarry as soon as you're in your coffin, aren't you? And everything you've ever worked for will end up in the pockets of her and some other man. Am I right?" Louis could no longer control his anger, and he coughed violently, his entire face turning red. "You disloyal boy!" Brock smiled faintly and looked as if he really didn't care. The air became tense, and Brock waited to see what his father would say next. But Louis calmed himself again and tried to ease the tension. "Brock, you're my son. We've had our ups and downs, but we're still father and son. Your mother's no longer with us, and there shouldn't be enmity between us." He shuffled awkwardly on his feet. He obviously found it difficult to speak in such a way to his son, and Brock enjoyed watching him squirm. "I won't give any of my property or assets to Anna. I'd like to give some to Joe, but he'll have to wait until he's 18 years old to inherit it. And that's another 16 years from now. Who knows where he and his mother will be by then? That's why I want you to have it." Brock listened to the desperation in his father's voice. Louis was caught between leaving his wealth to Joe, who would have to wait 16 years before he saw any of it, and give it to Brock, even though he had disowned him. "The only reason he wants me to inherit his assets is so that Anna can't get her hands on them. It's nothing to do with the fact that I'm his eldest son." The room fell quiet. Brock looked at his father, who had aged a lot since the last time he had seen him, and childhood memories flashed through his mind. When he was young, he had always tried to win his father's approval with everything he did, but time and time again, he had been let down. When he was in school, there had been a parent-child sports event, and his father had never attended. He had always felt envious of the other children whose fathers always made an effort, while he never did. When he had been in his teens and started taking an interest in girls, instead of giving him the father-son talk, Louis had just sat him down in front of a video and left him to make of it what he would. As a result, they had drifted further and further apart, and there had been more and more arguments, which had culminated that day at Brock's villa when Louis had thrown a vase at him. There had been so many incidences that had affected both of their lives, and, in the end, the chasm between them had grown so wide that it had become irreparable. He had long given up on their relationship. It exhausted him, and he no longer had any expectations for reconciliation. He wanted nothing to do with the man who was his father only by blood. Brock gave Louis an empty look. "I'm back with Hannah. She and I were going to have a child once, but because of something I did, she lost the baby. It's now unlikely that she'll ever be able to conceive again." He spoke slowly, emphasizing each word to make sure his father understood what he was saying. "I'll never marry anyone else, so I'll probably never have a child. Do you understand?" The realization of what he was hearing hit Louis like a blow to the head, and he fell onto his office chair, thinking that karma had finally caught up to him. He stared at his son, who was still leaning against the door, and felt as if all his hard work over the decades had been in vain. "I can't accept this. There has to be a solution. I need to think." Brock didn't have the patience to wait for Louis's response, and he turned around, opened the door, and left his father's study. Louis sat on his office chair, breathing rapidly. He thought he was going to pass out. He took a few deep breaths and tried to pull himself together. Just then, his phone rang. It was his assistant. "Sir, may I ask if you still need the lawyer to come over tomorrow? Do you need me to change the appointment?" "No, thank you," he He can come as arranged." Of course. The assistant hung up, and Louis slumped back on his chair, unsure what to do next. Brock didn't want to return to the living room and face Anna and Joe again, so he went to his old bedroom. He found the room had changed considerably. The furniture was mostly the same, but it had all been moved around, and the carpet and curtains had been changed. A number of toys were scattered across the floor. He looked around and smiled bitterly. He didn't bother to enter because it didn't seem like his room anymore. He decided he would stay in a hotel instead. As he turned to leave, Anna appeared with Joe in her arms. "I'm sorry, Brock. Joe likes this room, but he's not supposed to play in it." She put Joe down, dashed inside, and quickly gathered up the child's toys. Brock watched, but he didn't voice the thoughts that were running through his mind. Of all the rooms in this house, did they have to move into mine? If Dad hadn't found out he had cancer, they'd probably still be sleeping in my bed. The Porter family home was huge, with many bedrooms. It seemed to Brock that they had been using his room just to rub their nose at the fact that he had been removed from the family. He shook his head with disdain. He was about to walk away when he felt something tugging on his pants. He looked down and found Joe there. He had a toy car in his hand, and he gazed up at Brock with big brown eyes. "Brock," he said, mispronouncing the name in his childish way. In his innocence, he had no idea about the feud that was going on between his father and his older brother. He just grinned at Brock and waved his toy car. "Play with me." Brock sighed. He didn't know how to behave around children, and if he was honest, he didn't particularly like Joe. He partially blamed the child for his parents' separation, but deep down, he knew that was unfair. He blamed Anna, too, and all the other women who had come before her. But really, the person responsible was his father. Or perhaps Mom and Dad should never have gotten married in the first place. Joe tugged again on the leg of his pants and wouldn't let go. He looked pleadingly up at Brock, and Brock knew he wouldn't be able to refuse. Anna returned and pried her little son's hand away from Brock's pants. "Don't bother your brother Joe. He's too busy to play with you right now. Mommy'll play with you, okay?" "I want Brock." Joe screwed up his eyes in frustration and looked like he was about to burst into tears. Brock crouched down to Joe's height and took his hand. "You want to play? Then let's play downstairs." Joe's face lit up, and he skipped along beside his big brother as they made their way together down the stairs and into the living room. The next day, Louis's lawyer and their two assistants arrived for their arranged meeting and were led straight to Louis's study. After an hour's discussion, Brock and Anna were allowed in, and the lawyer addressed them all. "In order to avoid any disputes regarding inheritance, Mr. Porter has agreed to announce the contents of his will in advance. On behalf of Mr. Porter, I will now read the will." Anna's heart leapt into her mouth. She hugged Joe to her chest and stared straight into the lawyer's face. "All the real estate, investments, securities, and shares under Mr. Porter's name are to go to his eldest son, Brock Porter." The color drained from Anna's face, and she began to tremble. The lawyer continued. "Mr. Porter's savings, as well as his domestic and overseas assets, are to be divided as follows. 60% to his eldest son Brock, 35% to his youngest son Joe, and 5% to Anna." Louis was an old-fashioned man, and Brock wasn't surprised to hear that none of the women in the family, other than Anna, had been recognized in his will. Louis wasn't aware that Ashley wasn't his biological daughter, yet he still had put nothing aside for her. Brock also heard about some other illegitimate children that Louis had fathered over the years with various mistresses, but they were all female. When they had been born, he had given their mothers some money and sent them away. So, the only descendants that Louis considered worthy were his two sons. By the time the lawyer had finished reading the will, Anna looked as if she might explode. According to the law, Joe's portion of the inheritance could only be withdrawn when he turned 18. As for her 5%, although it was a significant amount of money, it was minuscule compared to Brock's portion. Up until that moment, to everyone but Brock, She had tried to give the impression that she didn't care about the money. She wanted them to think that she loved Louis for who he was and would miss him terribly when he was gone. But Louis had never loved a woman in his life. He was a misogynist, and to him, women only served one purpose, and that was to satisfy his needs. He had only been with Anna because she was young and fertile. She had given him a son, and so she had served her purpose. She was no longer of value to him. The atmosphere in the room was tense. Louis was the first to speak. "Brock, you stay here. The rest of you leave." Everyone left the room, leaving Brock and Louis alone. "Son, do you know why I distributed my wealth in that way?" Brock shrugged. "I don't know, and I don't want to know." Louis had always been an angry man, but his anger seemed to have fallen away. He sighed. "Because I can't entrust my future to a 2-year-old child. And what if my wife never gives birth to a child of her own? That's the risk I'm prepared to take." Louis looked at Brock with something close to compassion. "But at least for the next 20 years, I can count on you." At one time, Brock would have been excited to hear his father say that. It would have given him hope for some kind of reconciliation, but he knew it was too late for that. 30 years of worthless expectations had exhausted all of his enthusiasm. "Thank you." He gave his father a courteous nod. The father and son had nothing more to say to each other. Louis had almost reached the end of his life, and although he realized that he had spoiled their relationship, the damage was too deep, and there was nothing that could be said or done to repair it. Brock flew back to New York that afternoon, using the excuse that he had a lot of work to catch up on. Louis's health was getting worse each day. About 2 months later, Brock received a call from Brazil saying that his father was in critical condition. The doctors anticipated that he had only days to live. So Brock flew back to Brazil. Ashley's pregnancy was quite advanced by then, so she chose to stay home and not risk flying. Louis had asked to be allowed to go home from the hospital. He wanted to die in the comfort of his own home. On the face of it, the villa was as beautiful as a palace, but to Brock, it was the ugliest place on earth, filled with nothing but bad memories. He stood beside his father's bed and stared at the man who had abused him for his entire life. Louis was sleeping peacefully. Eventually, he opened his eyes and blinked a number of times until his eyes focused on Brock. He had almost lost the strength to speak, but when he saw his son, he became unexpectedly excited, and he grabbed his hand. "Brocky, I'll come and take part in the competition with you. Don't worry, son. I'll be there." Brock had no idea what Louis was talking about, and he could see the old man was delirious. "I'll go with you," Louis mumbled again, and he reached out with his other hand, as if he were trying to grab something. "Dad will play basketball with you." He had a strange look on his face, and Brock wondered if it was the makings of a smile, which was something he rarely saw on his father's face. Then, Brock understood what his father was talking about. When he was in elementary school, there had been a parent-child basketball game. He had begged Louis for weeks to take part with him, and he had finally agreed. But on the day of the match, he waited for his father a long time. The other kids' parents had all arrived, one after another, and he had wanted to believe so badly that his own dad would arrive. But by the time the game had gotten underway, he was the only child still waiting for a parent. He had found out later that Louis had been too busy and had forgotten all about his promise. I wonder if he remembered that basketball game because he finally feels bad for letting me down so many times. But Brock was no longer that little boy. He had gotten used to never getting anything from his father, and none of it was important anymore. Just then, Louis's grip on Brock's hand loosened, and his arm dropped to his side and hung limply over the edge of the bed. Brock's heart was filled with overwhelming emotions. He took a deep breath. "I'm afraid it's too late, Dad." Louis's funeral was a grand one. He was buried alongside his wife, Mia, which puzzled a number of the guests. They had been separated for longer than they had been together, so it seemed a curious choice to many that they should spend eternity side by side. Although Anna and Joe didn't receive any of Louis's shares, the The savings they inherited were enough to set them up for the rest of their lives. After the funeral, Brock handled the routine inheritance procedures, and then he flew back to New York. He arrived home late at night. Hannah had just taken a shower, and he found her wrapped in a lacy nightgown and towel drying her hair in the bedroom. He took her in his arms and held her tightly. He buried his face in her wet hair and inhaled its fresh fragrance. "My past is behind me, Han. I no longer have anything to do with it." Hannah knew that Brock hated his father, but Louis was still his father, and that had connected them in a way that no other relationship could. She held the back of his head and rubbed his back as he sobbed in her arms. "It's okay to be sad." "I'm not really sad. I just feel empty." He didn't know how to describe the feeling that had engulfed him. The resentment and disappointment that he had felt for years had been replaced by a strange emptiness. He gazed into her eyes with the saddest look she had ever seen. "Stay with me. Don't leave me." The look on his face tore at her heartstrings, and she felt tears prick the corner of her eyes. She nodded simply. There was no need for words. Without warning, Brock pressed his lips against hers with a sense of desperation. He opened her mouth with his with some urgency, and then she felt his hand slip under her nightgown. Hannah fell asleep in his arms shortly after they made love. Brock still had energy to burn and was eager to go again, but he forced himself to calm down by taking some deep breaths. In the weeks and months that followed, Brock settled the chaos at Obsidian Industries and regained control of the company. At the same time, his own company was flourishing and things were looking up. Brock and Hannah rushed to the hospital on the day that Ashley gave birth to her baby. Ashley had always kept herself fit and healthy, and her baby arrived smoothly with no complications. Cassandra. Latham held his daughter in his arms and gazed lovingly at her tiny sleeping face. Hannah was desperate to hold the baby girl, and as she leaned over to take her from Latham, the baby's eyes opened briefly and looked directly at her. "Oh my goodness, Han," Brock said. "You're one of the first people baby Cassandra is seeing." Latham felt a little miffed. "No, it was me she looked at first." "What about me? I'm her mother." Ashley felt most left out. "All of you only want the baby now. No one wants anything to do with me anymore." Ignoring his wife's comment, Latham smiled at his daughter. "Honey, do you think Cassandra looks like me?" Ashley shook her head in despair, but she didn't reply. She just wanted to cuddle her new baby girl, but she was like a hot potato being passed around from one person to another, and it seemed that her own mother would have to wait her turn. Jonathan didn't push Nancy aside after she gave birth. She thought bitterly, "Why is everyone ignoring me?" Her emotions were running high, and she felt more and more annoyed as Latham ignored her and cooed with the baby. "She's got him wrapped around her little finger already. Looks like she's going to be a daddy's girl." Tears began to trickle down her cheeks, but no one noticed. Just then, Nancy arrived with Tristan and noticed that Ashley seemed somewhat upset. Thinking quickly, she took her baby boy over to her and placed him in her arms. "Tristan wants to play with you." Tristan was already 6 months old and had begun to crawl. He smiled at Ashley, and she took him in her arms. Instantly, most of Ashley's negative emotions melted away, and she hugged Tristan until he got too heavy. Then, she placed him on the bed beside her, and he wriggled under the blanket. Later that day, when she was discharged from the hospital, she announced that, instead of going home, she wanted to go to Nancy's house. Without looking at Latham, she took her sister-in-law by the arm and led her to the door. "Come on, Maria." Latham watched as they left the hospital room, his mind spinning with confusion. "Ash, what are you doing? Why are we going to Jonathan's place? We need to take our baby home." Ashley ignored him. "I'll teach him a lesson." He thought she must be joking, but when he saw her open the door of Jonathan's car, he panicked. "Ash, did I do something wrong?" "Oh, at last. You finally realized." Ashley climbed into the back seat with Nancy and strapped Cassandra into a baby seat.
She instructed the autonomous car to lock the doors, and then it drove off. The thumb watched in astonishment as his wife and newborn baby drove away down the road and around the corner until they were out of sight. He stood helplessly in the street for several minutes, scratching his head and wondering what had just happened. He pulled himself together and hurried to his car. He got in and followed them to Nancy and Jonathan's house. Jacob finished his studies at his current school and then transferred to a different school in New York City, which happened to be the school that Katie attended. Jacob was in the high school while Katie was in the middle school. When Henry found out that Katie and Jacob were going to the same school, he decided that he also wanted to transfer schools to be with them. So, during the last semester, that's what he did. And he was excited when he was put in the same class as his friend. When Helga was 6 months pregnant, she agreed with Jonathan that she would help Carol recuperate again, so she moved back into the Davis mansion. Her baby belly was already quite big, and a few months earlier, at one of her routine scans, she had discovered that she was having a baby girl. She and Steve had decided they would call her Cynthia. Nancy's 3 babies were growing up fast, and Helga had decided it would be fun to see if one of them showed any signs of an interest in medicine yet. The test would be held at the Davis mansion. So on one sunny Sunday, Helga, Steve, Nancy, Jonathan, and Carol all gathered in the living room with the triplets. The adults had each brought a selection of items, which they placed on the coffee table in the living room. Among the items were various toys, such as cars, dolls, airplanes, and robots, as well as some food items. In amongst it all, Helga placed a colorful bottle of medicine with a child-proof lid. The idea was that each child would be given the opportunity to select the thing that they were most attracted to. The coffee table was low enough for the 3 children to see and reach everything on it. The first to be tested was Tristan. Jonathan carried his elder son up to the table and placed him in front of it. The adults sat back and waited to see what would happen. Carol sat on the edge of the couch, watching her grandson with eager anticipation. Helga watched nervously. Even though the test was only a bit of fun, she couldn't help taking it a little seriously. She was desperate to know who her apprentice would be, and she could hardly wait for the children to grow up and show an informed interest in medicine. Nancy sat on the couch next to Carol with Rebecca and Callum on her lap and waited to see what Tristan would do. Her little boy placed his hands on the table, and she saw his eyes widen at all the objects on it. He reached out and grabbed a toy car with one hand and a robot with the other. Then, he turned around and toddled off toward his mother to play with what he had picked. Each looked at each other and smiled. Tristan hadn't chose medicine. Jonathan refilled the gaps left by 2 objects that his son had taken, and then it was Callan's turn. Steve plucked the little boy off his mother's lap and carried him to the table. But Callum didn't want to play by the rules. He showed no interest in the items on the table. Instead, he pinched Steve's cheek. Then, he pulled his ear, and everyone, except Steve, laughed. "That's the last time I pick up this little brat," Steve thought, pulling the boy's hands away from his face. "I hope my daughter will be better behaved than him." The more annoyed Steve became, the more Callum wanted to play with him, and it wasn't long before Steve's face was covered in red blotches. The child laughed mischievously until Jonathan got up and took him from Steve. Jonathan knew how to control his son, and Callum stopped his mischievous behavior as soon as his father took him into his arms. "Callum, Daddy wants you to pick something from the table." He placed him in front of the table and watched as the little boy's eyes scanned all of the objects before him. Snot began to run out of his nose, but he didn't yet know how to sniff it back up, so he let it trickle down into his mouth. He knocked Helga's medicine bottle over and threw it on the floor. Everyone watched in silence. Helga's jaw dropped in astonishment. She knew it was silly, but she couldn't help feeling injured by Callum's antics. "Okay, Callum, take something." Jonathan spoke gently to his son and pointed to all the other things on the table, but there was nothing that attracted Callum's attention. Instead, he turned around and toddled over to his brother. Defiantly, he snatched the robot out of Tristan's hand. "That's Tristan's, Callum. Look, there's another robot here."
Jonathan gently pried the robot out of his hand and pointed to the robot on the table. But Callum didn't want the other robot. He looked left and right, finally choosing a car and a banana. Jonathan peeled the banana for him and looked sheepishly at Helga. Callum ate half the fruit and discarded the rest. Then he started to play with his car on the carpet, chuckling all the time. Next, it was Rebecca's turn. Nancy carried her daughter up to the table and prayed to herself that she would behave better than Callum had. "Okay, Rebecca, what do you like?" "Choose anything you like, Rebecca, honey," Jonathan added, just as Callum decided it was a good time to throw his toy car across the room. Nancy looked apologetically at the other adults and went to pick Callum up. She held him firmly on her lap so that he couldn't get into any more mischief. Rebecca looked at the colorful array of objects on the table, and then she picked up an airplane. Nancy and Jonathan exchanged surprised glances. They had both expected her to pick the little robot. Then, she put the plane back down on the table, and what she did next surprised everyone. She picked up the bottle of medicine and began shaking it. Helga's heart leaped, and she began to clap her hands with joy. "I found my little apprentice." Helga beamed with happiness. Just as she had hoped, the bottle of medicine fascinated little Rebecca. She even smiled sweetly as she held it in her little hands. Helga recalled the day that her master had done the same test with her. She had only been offered medicinal plants, so she had had little choice. It had been her destiny to work in the field of homeopathic medicine. She was happy that 2 girls in the family would most likely follow in her footsteps. Rebecca would also be able to learn alongside her own daughter. Satisfied with the children's choices, Carol smiled broadly. She hugged Rebecca tightly and cuddled her before she let her go and play on her own. She then picked up Callum. The little boy wiggled in her arms as she sat him on her lap. "Now, Callum, tell me why you pinched Steve." Callum blinked at her and wrinkled his nose. He muttered incomprehensible words until he wriggled off her lap and crawled toward Helga. He stopped at her feet and stretched his arms out for her to pick him up. Being pregnant didn't stop her from picking him up, and she bent over to lift him onto her lap. He smiled at her and tugged at her blouse until she leaned closer. To everyone's surprise, he kissed her on the cheek. Stunned, they stared at him in silence. Callum had gotten what he wanted and looked at Steve with a naughty grin. Steve frowned and was about to get up and take him away from Helga, but the little boy clung onto her and scrunched his face as if he was about to start crying. Helga shook her head at Steve. "Leave him alone. He's too cute. He wants to cuddle me." Steve was left speechless. He glared at Helga and the toddler on her lap. Nancy immediately understood why Callum had pinched Steve. She turned to Jonathan. "It looks like our second-born has a strong personality, just like you." Jonathan grinned and teased Steve. "You'd better watch out. This isn't the first time he's kissed her." Steve didn't find the comment amusing. He didn't respond either. He kept quiet and sulked. Carol stifled a laugh. Obviously, the little boy liked Helga and hadn't appreciated how Steve had glared at him either. He had pinched Steve to get back at him. To make matters worse for Steve, Callum had done it while everyone was watching, so he couldn't do anything about it. Steve shook his head in disbelief, not impressed by the little boy's arrogance. Carol couldn't hold in her laugh any longer and giggled as she rubbed the toddler's hair. She turned to Steve and scolded him. "Why do you look so angry? Are you jealous of a little boy?" Astonished, Steve lowered his head and stared at his shoes. He knew there was no point in arguing with her. After dinner, Nancy got the triplets ready to go home while Jonathan collected their toys and other belongings scattered around the house. They were about to leave when Helga called out to Jonathan. "Before you go, I just wanted to let you know that I've checked out all the prescriptions you gave me. A lot of them are very complicated and will take me some time to figure out. But I wanted to ask you if you saw any treatments for brain tumors." Jonathan thought for a moment
and then nodded. Yeah, I may have. I haven't given you all the information yet. I didn't want you to stay up all night reading, so I only gave you half. I'll give you the rest later on. By the way, I must also give you the old manuscripts passed down by the Jung family. Steve had pertinently asked Jonathan not to give Helga everything. Knowing her, she would become so engrossed in the materials that she wouldn't eat or sleep until she had read everything. She was pregnant and had to take it easy. Helga understood what Jonathan meant and smiled politely. Thank you. I appreciate it, but I asked about the treatment for tumors because someone inquired about it. Steve glanced at her curiously. Who asked? Because Jonathan was now her family, and because Oliver hadn't asked her to keep it a secret, Helga quickly answered. It was Oliver Williams. He called me the other day and said a friend has been diagnosed with a brain tumor. He said his friend wanted to try homeopathic alternatives instead of modern treatments. The color drained from Steve's face, and his eyes darkened. Only a handful of people knew what had happened between him and the Williams family. Nobody had told Helga anything. Steve took a deep breath. Let's go talk somewhere in private. He gestured to Helga, Jonathan, and Nancy, directing them toward a small reading room down the hallway. He closed the door and turned to Helga. There's something you need to know. Oliver has been harboring a grudge against the Davis family for a long time. He carefully explained the history between the Williams, Davis, and the Jung families. Jonathan's brothers and the Johnsons died at the hands of Oliver's late father, Arthur. Oliver gave explosives to James Reynolds, who then tried to kill himself and Jonathan. Then, a few years ago, I was almost killed in an explosion while working in Mexico. It turned out that Arthur had ordered a hit on me. Helga was astonished. She gasped and looked at Steve with wide eyes. I never knew that. Oliver said he got my contact information from Esther, and he phoned me to ask if I knew of a homeopathic treatment to help his friend. Jonathan sighed. We once helped him with a treatment for burn wounds. It was a Jung prescription. We were forced into making a deal with him, so we exchanged the prescription for a black box. But that was a once-off. It's different now. Steve nodded, and he swallowed to restrain his rage. Yeah, even though his family didn't kill us, they tried. We won't have any dealings with him because of that. I'll never forgive Oliver for what he did to our family. We'll most definitely not help him again. As a doctor, Helga was duty-bound to save lives and treat the sick or injured. But hearing that Oliver's family had almost killed her husband, she had no choice but to reconsider. She didn't want to help Oliver if he was as wicked as his father had been. Don't worry, I won't help him any longer. I'll contact him and let him know. Nancy sighed with relief. Although Jonathan and Steve knew her real identity, Helga didn't. Arthur had been behind the plan that killed Nancy's parents, and she would have died too, had she not been reborn as Maria. Although Oliver hadn't been directly involved in her parents' death, she couldn't stand him. They had only tolerated him because they had to when Esther's life had been in danger, and he was the only one who had been able to help them. After everyone went home that evening, Helga sent Oliver a message. Mr. Williams, I regret to inform you that I can't help you. Steve Davis is my husband. She then deleted his contact details immediately afterward. Oliver had just walked out of Reggie's room when he heard a notification beep on his phone. He glanced down and saw Helga's message. He smirked as he read it. He wondered if Helga could save him and if she had already found the prescription. But because of the hatred between the two families, she couldn't help him. He quickly typed a reply. Thank you. He noticed that Helga had blocked him, and a bitter smile crept over his face. Frustrated, he threw his phone down and pinched the bridge of his nose. He wanted to go to the study, but suddenly felt a sharp pain in his head. He stood still and breathed slowly, waiting for the headache to recede. He had been reading a lot, which didn't help with his frequent headaches. He had started radiation therapy, and the doctor had advised him that it would take several sessions to reduce the size of his tumor. One of the side effects was headaches. Oliver sighed. He was exhausted and didn't have the energy to deal with work. He slowly walked to his bedroom and laid down on his bed. He closed his eyes, but found it difficult to fall asleep. So he listened to the bedside clock tick as his mind wandered. He had to find a way to ensure he would be alive long enough to watch his only son grow up. There was nothing more important to Oliver than his son. As the sole heir to the Williams family name and fortune, he knew how important it was to safeguard Reggie's future. He couldn't guarantee it if he were to die from a brain tumor. In the small rural town beside the rushing river, not too far away from Oliver's estate, Zoe lay in bed and finally fell asleep. Her daughter had been sick on her birthday, so Zoe had delayed her birthday celebrations by a few days until she felt better. It had been a good day. Josephine had caught many fish that morning and was in high spirits. Zoe took Layla and joined Josephine down by the river for a picnic. Zoe placed a few items on the grass mat for Layla to choose from. The items included a fishing net, coins, baking pans, and a pen. Being only a year old and having just recently learned to walk, Layla grabbed her mother's legs and pulled herself up. She tried to walk toward the mat, but fell over. She scrunched her little face, curious to see what was on the grass mat. Instead of trying to walk, she crawled across the dirt. Layla glanced at the fishing net and coins. She moved closer to the baking pan and looked at it briefly before she changed her mind and grabbed the pen, clutching it tightly with her little fingers. Josephine clapped her hands with excitement. "This is wonderful! Our little Layla has chosen a pen to play with among all the other toys and items. She's a smart one. She's going to have a promising future." The rural towns in Cuba had always been backward and steeped in tradition. Rural life in Cuba differed from rural life in America, with a vast divide between the wealthy and the poor. Upper-class families in Havana lived a similar lifestyle to their American counterparts, whereas those in the rural areas had much more challenging lives. People in rural towns often followed the same path as their parents. They did the same work as their parents and weren't well educated. In most towns, the highest level of education was a high school diploma. When kids finished school, they would go out and seek work. Very few, if any, made it to university. Not a single child from Josephine's town had attended university for several years. Josephine opened her arms for Layla to crawl toward her. She picked her up and lifted her into the air. "My darling Layla, you've been blessed with the hope of a better life than your mother and I. You must work hard and do well in school, and opportunities will soon come your way. Hopefully, you'll be able to make a difference and improve your mother's life as well." Zoe laughed. "And your grandmother's life, too." Josephine smiled, and wrinkles formed around her eyes and mouth. She sighed happily. "I can't wait to see what she becomes when she grows up. Unfortunately, I'm nearing the end of my life, and I fear I'll be gone before that happens." Tears welled in Zoe's eyes. She had lived in a small town for over a year and had adopted Josephine as her mother. The old lady treated her like a daughter, and they had formed a close bond. She gently squeezed Josephine's arm. "You've still got many years left in you. Take care of yourself properly, and you'll have the pleasure of watching Layla blossom into a successful young woman one day." Josephine nodded and smiled. She kissed the little girl's rosy cheek. "You're such a sweet little girl. We adore you." Layla didn't understand what the women were talking about, but she saw Zoe's teary eyes and reached out to wipe away the tears. She looked at her mama and smiled. "Mama." Zoe felt her heart would melt. She took a deep breath and kissed her forehead before turning to Josephine. "I've been thinking about it for some time now. We'll stay here until Lola's old enough to start school." Josephine nodded reluctantly. "I guess it's a good idea. I'll work hard and sell as much fish as possible to save money for Layla's studies." Zoe was eternally grateful for Josephine's kindness and everything she had done for her and Layla. She looked forward to the day when she could find a place for them to live, send Layla to kindergarten, and find a job to support them. Zoe had graduated from an Ivy League university,
and she knew several foreign languages. She didn't have much work experience, but had worked as an intern for a while. She knew it would take a bit of time to find her feet. She decided she would take Josephine to the city as soon as she had earned enough money, and would spoil her the way she had spoiled her own mother. She thought about her mother and felt a lump in her throat. She was worried about her. Oliver had kept his word and had sent money to her mother every month during Zoe's pregnancy. He had also arranged for her to be transferred to a good hospital, but she didn't know whether her mother had ever had the much-needed operation. Her mother's paralysis could be treated if the operation was successful, although she would have to have intensive physical therapy afterward. If all went well, she had a good chance of being able to walk and move properly again. Zoe kept her thoughts to herself and gently rocked her daughter to sleep before she got up to help Josephine with the day's catch. It was late by the time they had stowed the fishing nets and neatly packed the baskets. Zoe lay in bed and rubbed moisturizer on her dry, calloused hands. She felt depressed and tried to cheer herself up by counting her blessings. Everyone had a different path in life, but they still had to work to stay on it. Some people were born lucky, while others had to endure hardship. She sighed and thought about her son, who would have a different life than his sister. Life was busy, and many things happened during the next 2 years. Peter and Sheena had gotten married and had a daughter. She had just turned 1. Sydney and Norman's son had been born. They had named him Jimmy, and he was about 2 years old. Helga was expecting her second child and was 6 months into her pregnancy. They had named their daughter Cynthia and were thinking of calling their next child, who was a boy, Wesley. Ashley was also pregnant again. This time, she was expecting a boy, and the Thom had chosen to name him Jason. She was only 3 months along. Brock's company and Obsidian Industries had performed well, and business was booming. He had given up all his assets to avoid being stuck in a loveless arranged marriage, yet he and Hannah had never remarried. His colleagues and clients had often asked him about it, and he had replied, "I'm already married." Until one day, someone had snooped around and had discovered that he was divorced. Jack's daughter, Lydia, had turned 1 month old. He hosted a party at his house to celebrate. Hannah stood aside and watched everyone talk and laugh happily. She drank more wine than she usually did and became tipsy. Brock had to help her back to the car to take her home. He had repurchased their villa from Jonathan, and they happily lived together. He had brought up the subject of remarrying many times, but she rejected the notion each time. They got into the car and drove away. Unbeknown to them, a car parked nearby watched their every movement and slowly followed as Brock drove out of the suburb and turned onto the main road. Jack's house was a short drive away from Brock's. Hannah sat in the front passenger seat and stared listlessly out the window. Suddenly, she sighed loudly. "I think we should call it quits." Shocked by her sudden outburst, Brock hit the brakes and the tires squealed on the tar road. "Why would you say that?" Hannah smiled wryly. She had a dismissive tone in her voice. "We've been trying for years. I'm tired, and I give up." Brock tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "But we decided to adopt a baby if you don't conceive by your next birthday." He reached over and put his hand on her thigh. "Don't worry about it so much." Hannah had been drinking at the party, so she suddenly lost control of her pent-up emotions. She pushed his hand away. "I feel useless. I can't do this anymore. It's not fair to you. You deserve a child of your own. You shouldn't have to adopt one." After a short silence, Brock slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. He turned to face Hannah and looked her in the eyes. "I'm the useless one, not you." He leaned over and kissed her tenderly. Tears rolled down her cheeks, and he tasted the bitter saltiness on his lips. She tried to push him away, but he embraced her in his strong arms. He switched off the car's engine and lights, and then rolled down her seat. She saw desire burn in his eyes. She wiped away her tears, and then surrendered to him. The street was dark with a few streetlights, and the black car seemed to melt into the darkness. The car following them had been held up at a red traffic light a few blocks behind. It sped past them, and the driver didn't notice Brock's car parked in the shadows. Hannah had never made love in the car before and was nervous until she followed Brock's lead. His passion was intense, almost forceful. Half an hour later, Brock started the engine and drove home. As they turned into their street, the car that had driven past them earlier came speeding past in the opposite direction. It suddenly swerved, turned around, and raced up behind Brock. It then overtook him and stopped, blocking the road. Brock stopped his car, pulled up the handbrake, and got out. He looked at Hannah. "Stay here and don't get out." Hannah was worried. She also felt anxious because of their moment of passion in the car. Her emotions were a mess. She knew she should feel happy because Brock stood steadfast in his resolve to love her no matter what. Yet she couldn't shrug off the sadness and disappointment in her heart. She rolled down her window and peered at the car that had stopped them, ready to call the police if necessary. But when she saw the car's license plate, her heart suddenly skipped a beat, and her palms began to sweat. The driver had also gotten out and walked toward Brock. Hannah gasped. It was her father. Then she saw her mother get out of the front passenger side. Hannah's father, Nicholas, glared at Brock and quickly waved toward his car. They had been visiting a friend who lived in the same suburb as Jack and had been surprised to see Brock accompany a woman to his car. She had appeared drunk, but they hadn't seen her properly because it had already become dark. Hannah's mother, Wendy, had looked at Nicholas. "Is that Hannah?" Nicholas shook his head. "I don't believe Han would be so rude not to greet us when she's in our neighborhood. Besides, she said she was away. Can't be her." But as soon as Brock had opened the car door and the car's interior lights had switched on, Nicholas had recognized his daughter. She had told him she was away on a business trip. He had wanted to go over and confront her, but Brock had driven away before he had had the chance. All he could do was follow after them. Nicholas and Hannah locked eyes briefly before she turned away, mortified and guilt-stricken. Her father was so angry that his face went red and he stomped his feet. He was furious with her because she had deceived him. Worried that she would end up a spinster, he had tried to set her up on several blind dates, but she had turned each one down. He now understood why. He turned to Brock. "Haven't you hurt my daughter enough already? Why are you still harassing her?" Wendy approached Brock's car. Tears shimmered in her eyes. "Han, my child, you can't be with this man. He mistreated you. What are you thinking?" Brock realized they were about to take her away from him. "Please, I'm serious about your daughter. I want to—" Nicholas cut him short. "She divorced you. You have no business with her anymore." He hurried to the passenger door and yanked it open, grabbing Hannah by the wrist. "Come with us. We're taking you home." Hannah tried to struggle free. "Dad, Mom, listen to him." Wendy interrupted her before she could finish her sentence. She took Hannah's hand and held it tightly. "Whatever he said to you is a lie. Men like that don't change. Let's go home. We'll take care of you." Nicholas clenched his fists. "We won't force you to go on blind dates anymore. We'll stop trying to set you up with someone else. You can be single if you want. You have us to keep you company." Brock watched helplessly as they coaxed Hannah into their car. He stood in silence and watched them drive away. He knew they thought he was a monster and that they hated him. They were terrified that he would hurt Hannah if he got too close to her. It was a warm summer night, but Brock felt a chill run down his spine. He watched the car disappear into the darkness and felt like his world had come crashing down around him. His heart sank as he realized her parents would never like or accept him. He knew her inability to conceive was all his fault, and they would forever blame him for what had happened to her. Brock didn't see Hannah again after that night. He sent her several messages, but she never replied. He tried to phone her, but she never answered his calls. Instead, he kept an eye on her column and read her daily updates. It was the only way he could connect with her, as if she were still with him. One day, Hannah had finished writing an article and went to take a shower. As she slipped off her panties, she noticed a small drop of blood on them. She suddenly realized that her period was late. Her cycle was often irregular, so she didn't think much about it. She guessed that her period had finally started. She shrugged and took a long, hot shower. She got out of the shower and dried herself off. She wrapped her wet hair in a towel and went to her bedroom. Sighing, she sat down at her dressing table and looked at her reflection in the mirror. Hannah felt that she had tried her best with Brock, that they had been trying to conceive for several years, and the disappointment had left her feeling fatigued and desperate. She brushed her long hair and held back the tears that had welled up in her eyes. She wondered if this separation was an opportunity for both of them to move on with their lives. It had already been a month since they had last seen each other. She didn't want to drag Brock down with her problems anymore. Hannah went to bed that night with a heavy heart. When she woke up the following day, she noticed that her period hadn't started as she had been expecting it to. She also felt a faint discomfort in her abdomen. Hannah was used to her monthly cycle being out of sync and irregular. She didn't worry much about it and continued with her day. It was only much later that afternoon, when she noticed another drop of blood in her panties, that she became concerned. She didn't want to bother Helga, who was pregnant with her second child, so she phoned the local doctor and made an appointment. With her medical history, she wanted to make sure everything was okay. She got dressed and grabbed her handbag and car keys. She was about to climb into her car when she noticed someone approaching. To her surprise, she saw that it was Brock. He walked up to her car, opened the front passenger door, and got in. She stopped dead in her tracks. The emotions she had so carefully pushed into the depths of her heart suddenly poured out, and tears glistened in her eyes. Brock sat silently and watched her. He didn't say or do anything. He had been to lunch that afternoon with friends who stayed in the same suburb as her parents. After lunch, he had decided to take a chance and visit her, but he hadn't counted on seeing her. Brock hadn't had contact with Hannah for several weeks. Seeing her made his heart swell, and he realized he had been living in emotional turmoil without her. They had been together for several years, and he had long regarded her as his wife. They just didn't have the marriage certificate to prove it. He had missed her, and knew there wasn't anyone else in the world like her. Hannah stared at Brock, waiting for him to get out of the car. When he didn't move, she shrugged helplessly and opened the door. "I have an appointment." Brock smiled at her. "I'll go with you." He leaned over and gently pulled her into the car. He even helped her buckle her seatbelt. Feeling somewhat annoyed and tired, Hannah reluctantly obliged. She leaned back in her seat and sighed. "My family will never accept you. I can't change that. This is how it is." "And what is this exactly?" He leaned closer and gently kissed her lips. Her heart skipped a beat. "What do you want from me?" He lifted her chin and looked her in the eyes. "You promised me that you would hold out until your next birthday." He had a sad look in his eyes, almost as if he was disappointed. "Please, Han, I won't survive without you." Hannah lowered her eyes and took a deep breath. She didn't know how to react to his desperation. "It's almost too late." Brock shook his head. "But it isn't yet. Stay with me until then." He knew he had to take it slowly with her. He would have to think of another way to convince her to stay after her birthday. He had to play for time. Hannah didn't reply. She started the car. "I have a doctor's appointment. I'm going to be late. You should go now." Brock frowned. "You're going to the doctor? Is something wrong?" She shook her head. "It's nothing. It's just a checkup." He quickly fastened his seatbelt. "I'm coming with. I won't let you go alone." Hannah knew it would be futile to convince him otherwise. They arrived at the doctor's office a few minutes before Hannah's appointment. They sat quietly beside one another in the waiting room until the receptionist told them the doctor was ready to see her. Brock followed her down the hallway to the consultation room, but she stopped him at the door and went in alone. Brock leaned against the doorframe and watched her sit down. Although he had to wait outside, being there was good enough for him. She briefly explained her symptoms to the doctor and moved to the examination bed for him to do a few tests. He drew some blood, and several minutes later, when the results came back, he smiled. "You're pregnant." Hannah looked at him in shock. She frowned as if she had misheard him. "Are you sure?" He chuckled and began to write something on a notepad. "Yeah, I'm certain. You'll need to start taking vitamin supplements and get plenty of rest. Congratulations." Hannah gasped. She felt as though she could hardly talk. She cleared her throat and spoke in a soft, trembling voice. "But it's impossible. We've been trying to conceive for several years. I'm not supposed to be able to have a baby because of my endometriosis." The doctor smiled kindly. "I can do another test if you'd like, but it's unnecessary. You are pregnant. There's no doubt about it." Hannah was astonished. She heard the doctor's words echo in her ears. It was unbelievable. She almost didn't know how to feel. She and Brock had tried for years, and every month had brought new disappointment. She had come to terms with the fact that she would never conceive a child. She had been on the verge of breaking up with Brock because of it. Her heart began to pound in her chest, and she stared out the window in a daze. She wanted to laugh, and she wanted to cry. It all seemed so unreal to her. She had tried hard, hoping this day would finally come. She had taken countless tonics and remedies. She had even changed her diet and lifestyle in the hope that she would fall pregnant one day. It had been painful for her to stand by and watch as all of her friends, one after the other, had had babies. Each time, she had had to smile and pretend to be happy, when deep down inside, her heart shattered into a million pieces. And now, she was going to have a baby of her own. The joy and excitement of finally getting what she had wished for was overwhelming. The doctor was about to say something when an excited voice came from the other side of the doorway. "Doctor, how far along is she? Do we need to take any extra precautions now? Is everything okay?" "Take another look, just to be sure. I'll pay for an extra consultation." The doctor looked up and frowned when he saw Brock peeping his head around the door. The tall man standing before him looked like he could barely contain his excitement. Sighing softly, the doctor took Hannah's blood pressure and pulse. "She seems fine. She's about 5 weeks pregnant. The spotting is concerning. There's some risk of a miscarriage. My advice is that she rests and takes things easy. I can prescribe some medication if you like." Brock shook his head politely. When it came to medication, he only trusted Helga. He handed the doctor a wad of cash. "Thank you. This is the best news ever." He then walked over to Hannah, sitting on the examination bed. She looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Come on, Han. Let's go see Helga." He lifted her into his arms like a small child and carried her to the car. Brock carried Hannah out of the doctor's consultation room. She buried her face in his chest as tears rolled down her cheeks. The waiting room was full of people, and they stared at Brock, but he didn't care. Hannah was slightly annoyed. "Put me down. I can walk by myself." Brock shook his head. "No, you heard what the doctor said. You need to take it easy. You mustn't overexert yourself. It's not good for the baby." He didn't care what anyone thought. It felt like he was walking on air, and he smiled from ear to ear. Although he had said he would happily adopt a child, he was thrilled about having a biological child. He had seen how sad Hannah had become every time they had visited their friends with babies and small children. She had never said anything, but he had felt the guilt in her heart weigh heavier each time. He felt like he was the reason she couldn't conceive. He had caused her a lifetime of regret and sadness. Even if he were to offer his own life to take away her pain, it wouldn't make up for what he had done to her. But now that she was finally pregnant, they could move on from their past and face a new life with joy and happiness. He carried her until they got to the car. He opened the front passenger door and slid her gently onto the seat before fastening her seatbelt and tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ears. She looked at him with wide eyes. Hannah wanted to be sure she was pregnant before they went to Helga, so they stopped at a drugstore. Hannah bought a pregnancy test and quickly went to the bathroom. After a few minutes, she showed Brock the positive result. He beamed with happiness while she stared at the test in astonishment. They then went to see Helga. It was dinner time in the Davis household. Hannah and Brock's unannounced visit surprised everyone. Sophia quickly set 2 extra places at the dinner table and invited them to join them. Helga had moved back into the Davis mansion after falling pregnant again. Steve was often away on business, and Sophia had insisted she live with them so she wouldn't be alone with Cynthia. Carol had also arranged for someone to help Helga with her medical work. The little girl had grown fast and had become a rambunctious toddler. She knew Hannah well and ran over excitedly with outstretched arms to greet her. Hannah was about to pick her up when Brock intervened. Cynthia looked up at him and frowned. "No, Brock. I want Auntie Han." She spoke well for a child of her age. He gazed at the little girl and smiled kindly. He hoped his child would be as cute as her. "You should call me Uncle Brock." Cynthia glanced at him. "Oh." He bent down and rubbed her hair. "No, say Uncle Brock." The little girl scrunched her nose in confusion and decided to ignore him. She turned around and darted back to her parents. Steve chuckled as she clung to his legs. "Don't mind him. He had a car accident and hit his head." Cynthia gawked at him with wide eyes, and it seemed she had just realized something. Everyone else started to laugh. Brock didn't mind being teased. He watched Steve hug his daughter, and he smiled. He walked over to Helga. "Han is pregnant." Helga was surprised at the news. Although she had given Hannah various tonics and fertility remedies to help her conceive, she hadn't been sure that they would work. At best, she had expected it would take many years for Hannah to fall pregnant. The chances had always been very slim. She gestured for Hannah to sit down and immediately did a quick examination of her. A soft smile crept over her face, and she hugged Hannah. She also quickly prescribed something and gave it to her assistant to prepare. While they waited, she explained to Hannah what she should expect and the necessary precautions she should take to maintain a healthy pregnancy. The family sat down for dinner and chatted excitedly about the news of another addition to the ever-growing brood of children. After dinner, Brock and Hannah greeted everyone and drove back to Hannah's parents' house. He walked her to the front door. "Find out from your parents if they'll be home tomorrow evening. I want to ask them for permission to propose to you." Hannah smiled. She pressed her hands to her cheeks. "Is this really happening? Are we going to have a baby?" He nodded. "Yeah, we are." Her eyes lit up as she finally accepted it to be true. "I'm so happy." Brock held out his arms, and she leaned into his embrace. He hugged her tightly for a long time before finally letting go and kissing her on the cheek. "Go inside now. Get some rest. I'll see you tomorrow." That night, Hannah dreamed about a cute baby. The child had dark curly hair and called her Mama as she held it in her arms. The following evening, Wendy prepared dinner and Nicholas returned after a long day at work. The family of 3 had just finished eating when they heard the doorbell ring. Hannah waited nervously at the dining room table while Wendy went to see who it was. She opened the door and was shocked to find Brock standing outside. He was wearing a smart suit and holding various gift bags in one hand. Wendy was about to close the door, but Brock quickly stepped forward to block it. He smiled at her and walked into the house. Wendy closed the door behind him and scowled. "You're not welcome here." Nicholas heard the commotion and hurried into the living room. When he saw Brock, his eyes darkened and he looked furious. Brock pretended not to notice, and he smiled politely. "I've come to ask for your daughter's hand in marriage." Nicholas scoffed. "Never. You had your chance. My daughter won't marry you, even if it means she'll remain alone for the rest of her life." Hannah heard her father's angry voice and didn't know if she should intervene. Nicholas's harsh words didn't deter Brock in the slightest. I know that I let your daughter down in the past, but I promise that it will never happen again. I'll love and cherish her the way she deserves to be treated. Please, give me another chance. He put the gift bags down on the coffee table. Hannah is going to have my baby. Nicholas stared at Brock in disbelief. Wendy looked at him and gasped. It suddenly became so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. Brock used their stunned silence to continue speaking. I hurt Han because I took my problems out on her. I wasn't mature enough to realize what I was doing to her. I was irrational and selfish. For that, I am truly sorry. It has taken me several years to acknowledge and deal with my problems. But I'm not the same man you met all those years ago. Hannah is my soulmate, and I want to spend the rest of my life with her and our child. He paused and took a deep breath. I know you don't believe me, but I have come here today with my heart on my sleeve. I've also brought gifts and a little something to ease your financial burden as a goodwill gesture. He pointed to the gift bags on the coffee table. Brock picked up one of the gifts he had set on the table and opened it. This envelope contains the holding documents for Obsidian Industries, the investments from my father, and all my other property certificates. I'm willing to give all these assets to Hannah. I hope you can trust me and give us your blessings. Nicholas and Wendy were startled. They exchanged doubtful glances and then looked at Brock, who continued to try to convince them. If anything happens and she leaves me, I'll have nothing. I'm so confident we belong together that I'm prepared to take that risk. He paused for a moment and looked them both in the eye. I want to marry Hannah because I love her. In these past few years, we've become closer than ever. I can't bear a life without her in it. Wendy and Nicholas glanced at each other, and Brock felt that they might be about to come around. Besides, we have a baby on the way, and I want our child to grow up in a complete family unit, with parents to love and nurture it. He looked at them pleadingly. Please say you approve. Hannah had been watching and listening and hoping her parents could accept Brock back into their family. She would be 30 years old in another year's time, and she had gotten to a point where she had thought she would never live the dream of settling down with a family. But that dream had been resurrected. All it needed was her parents' blessing. The past few years had come and gone without any issues. Brock treated her well. He liked to indulge her, and he had even been prepared to accept that they may never have children. She could never leave him. Mom, Dad, I want to marry him. I believe in him. Brock held his breath at the sound of her voice, and his eyes filled with love for her. Nicholas and Wendy looked at him, and Hannah in turn couldn't deny what they saw. Their daughter was happy, and Brock's sincerity couldn't be more obvious. In addition, Nicholas had investigated Brock's private life and had found out that he had often been faced with all kinds of temptations, but he hadn't given in to any of them. They could see, too, that Hannah had become much more cheerful over the past few years. Her mood had improved a lot, her cheeks were rosier, and she had gained a little bit of weight. She looked altogether healthier and happier than they had seen her in a long time. And they were going to have a child together. Nicholas sighed and looked at Wendy again. She nodded, and then he gave them their blessing. We can see that you're sincere, and you do seem to be in love with each other. How can we say no? Brock and Hannah glanced at each other excitedly. But don't get me wrong, Nicholas added. We might have agreed, but you still need to keep proving yourself to us. Now go, and come back when you've set a date for the wedding. Brock breathed a sigh of relief. Mr. and Mrs. Marsh, thank you so much. I'll be back this weekend. Okay, now off you go. Wendy waved her hand at him. Brock left, grinning like a Chester cat, and winking at Hannah as he pulled the front door closed behind him. After that, everyone got along well, and the wedding plans flowed smoothly. Because of Hannah's pregnancy, they decided that they would delay the wedding until after the baby was born. It was the start of the new school year, and the triplets were due to start kindergarten. Nancy and Jonathan had planned to take the children together on their first day, but an emergency came up at Nancy's laboratory, and she was called in to carry out a technical repair of a robot that the Davis Group had recently developed. So, the task of taking the children to kindergarten fell on Jonathan alone. The triplets had all eaten their breakfast and were dressed for a fun first day in school, and Jonathan seemed to have everything under control. Tristan was wearing a short-sleeved checkered shirt, dark blue pants, and a pair of shiny black leather shoes. On several occasions, Nancy had tried to dress the two boys in matching clothes, but Callum didn't like to be the same as his brother. For his first day of school, he chose a pair of green shorts and an orange t-shirt with his favorite cartoon car printed on the front. Balanced on top of his head was a pair of sunglasses, worn in the same way his father often wore his. As for Rebecca, she wore a navy blue dress, white socks, and red leather shoes. Her eyes sparkled with excitement. As their father packed 3 lunchboxes, Rebecca went and stood in front of him and pointed at her hair. "Daddy, I haven't tied my hair." It was hanging loosely around her shoulders, and Jonathan could see several knots in it. Normally, it was Nancy who tied her hair up every day, but on that particular day, Jonathan resigned himself to the fact that he would have to do it himself. "Wait there, sweetie. I'll go get a hair tie and a brush." He went and found one of the many hair ties that always seemed to be lying around the house. When he returned, he put his daughter on his lap and gently brushed her hair, teasing each knot out as he went. He tried not to tug too hard in case it hurt her, and eventually, Rebecca's hair was soft and silky again. He took the hair elastic and began to twist it around her hair, recalling the style that Nancy usually did. But his hands, which were made for office work, kept getting in each other's way, and instead of tying Rebecca's hair, he ended up tangling his own fingers. He pulled his fingers away, and his daughter's hair fell to her shoulders once more. He cursed under his breath and tried again. "Daddy, it hurts." He let go of her hair, and it all tumbled out again. Jonathan could feel a slight headache coming on. He was bewildered that such a seemingly simple task could be so challenging. How the heck can it be harder to tie a child's hair up than to deal with a negotiation contract? Unwilling to let it defeat him, he took a few deep breaths and tried a 3rd, 4th, and 5th time, until, in the end, he gave up. He looked at his watch. "Sorry, sweetie. We're going to have to ask the kindergarten teacher to do it for you. We're going to be late otherwise." His forehead was covered in tiny beads of sweat. He looked at his daughter's messy hair and sighed, annoyed that it had beaten him. Then, he looked at his 2 sons to check that they were ready to leave. Tristan was sitting quietly on the couch with his school bag beside him, while Callum was tearing around the living room with a toy car, seemingly oblivious to the fact that he had somewhere important to be. Jonathan was trying desperately hard not to lose patience. "Come on, Callum. We can't be late on our first day." Callum didn't respond, but he ran out the door behind his father and siblings, still playing loudly with his car. "I'm going to school, 'cause I'm a big boy," he sang as he went out. Tristan was used to his brother's behavior, and he ignored him as he climbed into the car with his school bag and buckled himself into his child's seatbelt. Jonathan held his daughter's hand and helped her into her child's seat. "I like your hair out. We should do it like that more often." Rebecca smiled at him and pulled on her hair. Then she wriggled forward in her seat and gave him a sloppy kiss on the cheek. Jonathan felt his heart melt. But then his attention was drawn to Callum, who was wriggling around the car and singing loudly, and he had to grab the child and strap him into his seat. Then, with the protection of a bodyguard, they drove off in their autonomous car. As they pulled up outside the school, Esther and Xavier were also just arriving with their 2 sons. They were only a few days younger than the triplets, and all the children were excited to be starting kindergarten on the same day. Esther looked around for Nancy, but didn't see her. "Where's your lovely wife, Jonathan?" "Oh, she had to go to work early. Some issues with a robot." Then, Jonathan thought of something and put Rebecca down next to Esther. "Could you tie Rebecca's hair up for me, please?" Esther grinned. "Sure. Putting hair in pigtails is too challenging for you, is it?" Having only boys, She never got the chance to tie a girl's hair, and she hoped she might have a daughter someday. She crouched down behind Rebecca and took the hair ties from Jonathan. In a blink of an eye, the little girl's hair was beautifully presented in two neat little side buns.
Thank you, Auntie Esther.
Rebecca wrapped her arms around Esther's neck and hugged her. Forgetting about her boys, Esther took Rebecca's hand and led her into the school. Jonathan and Xavier followed behind with their boys. The kindergarten was a privately run establishment, and the parents had gone through an application process beforehand to secure their children's places. It was a small operation with only 15 or so children. The children were handed over to the teachers, and after a few ground rules had been laid down, the adults were free to leave. Rebecca watched as her father turned to leave, and tears began to well up in her eyes.
Daddy!
Jonathan stopped in his tracks and rushed back to her. He crouched down beside her. It's okay, Rebecca. You have fun with your brothers and the other children. After school, Mommy and Daddy will come pick you up.
I don't want you to go,
Rebecca sobbed pitifully. Jonathan hugged his daughter and gave her a kiss on the cheek. I have to go now, sweetie. Be brave. She nodded and wiped the tears away with her sleeve as she watched her father leave. Jonathan's heart was torn in two at having to leave his daughter behind. He could almost feel her eyes boring into his back. The temptation to run back and hug her again was almost too much, but he forced himself to walk through the school gates. Then, he realized he hadn't said goodbye to the boys. He couldn't go back inside, and he couldn't hear them crying for him, so he assumed they were all right, and he left. For most of the kids, it was the first time they had ever been separated from their parents, and the classroom was filled with the sounds of crying and wailing. Callum went and sat beside Tristan at one of the tables. His brother had found some building blocks and had begun to build towers. He seemed unaware of the noise around him. Behind them were Bo and Luke. Luke was crying, and his eyes were red and puffy, while Bo was happily chatting to the girl who was sitting across from him. Callum wished he had brought his toy car with him. He looked around and saw his sister. Her eyes were watery and red, but she seemed to be doing a good job of bravely containing her emotions. He waved at her, and she went and sat in the empty seat beside him. She sniffed constantly and kept wiping her nose on her sleeve. She looked around the room, and then she found a toy plane to play with, but she soon got bored and began pulling it apart so that she could rebuild it again. As she worked, she blocked out the cries of the other children. The noise was getting louder as those kids who hadn't initially cried began to join in until the classroom was filled with the sound of blubbering children. Callum was beginning to get restless. He looked around for a replacement toy car. Just then, two teachers came in, and one of them clapped their hands and stood at the front of the class, while the other one went to comfort the crying children at the back of the classroom. Welcome, children, to kindergarten. I know it can seem very scary, but I'm not a monster. Look. The teacher smiled kindly at them and tried to draw their attention to the two-hand puppets that she was using. One or two children stopped crying and watched as the teacher put on a little puppet show. But for most of them, her attempt was useless, and their crying continued. Some even called out for their mommies. The teacher was clearly used to such a situation, and she discarded the puppets and brought out a cake. She cut a small piece for everyone and handed the slices out. When they had all eaten their cake, she took out a book of stickers from her desk drawer. Now, whenever anyone is brave or does something well, I'm going to give them one of these gold star stickers as a reward. When you collect 10 gold stars, you can exchange them for a gift from the teacher. She scanned the room and saw that she had finally gotten most of the children's attention, and then her eyes fell on the two Davis boys in the front row. She removed one of the stickers and placed it on Tristan's shirt. Look at this little boy here. He's quietly building towers, so I've given him a gold star as a reward. Tristan shifted his gaze away from the blocks for the first time and smiled politely at the teacher.
Thank you, Miss Hammond.
She looked at him in surprise. How did you know my name? We haven't introduced ourselves yet. Tristan pointed at the name badge that was pinned to her shirt. Oh, you can read already? Tristan casually nodded and went back to playing with his blocks, while Miss Hammond chuckled awkwardly. I guess this little guy must be one of Jonathan Davis's kids. She continued to reward stickers to the children who were behaving well, and even Callum got one. He accepted his gold star, promptly turned in his chair, and then stuck it on Beau's left cheek. Beau looked up at him in surprise and touched his face. Callum laughed and pointed at the star on Beau's cheek. He looks really funny. Beau was the older of Esther's twins. He enjoyed being in the center of attention, and he was happy for Callum to make fun of him if it meant everyone was looking at him. He took his own sticker off his shirt and stuck it onto his other cheek, and Callum laughed even more. When Rebecca received a gold star, she stuck it onto the tail of a paper airplane she had made, forming a small logo. She flew the plane in the air with satisfaction. Miss Hammond had managed to settle most of the children, but there were still one or two who continued to blubber at the back of the classroom, and she did her best to make them feel better. But she had a class to run, and she needed to make sure they remained under her control. Okay, children, we're now all going to take turns introducing ourselves. I'm Miss Hammond, and I'm going to be your teacher every day. Then, she pointed at Tristan and asked him to come up to the front of the class and tell everyone his name. Tristan got up and went to stand next to Miss Hammond. He had always abided by the rules, but he liked to keep things short and sweet.
My name is Tristan, and I'm 3 years old.
And then he went and sat back down next to Callum. Next, it was Callum's turn. He got up and hopped to the front. He looked around and saw that some kids weren't paying attention, so he shouted loudly.
Dinosaurs!
Someone screamed, but everyone turned their attention to Callum. He looked around at the blotchy faces that stared wide-eyed at him and were covered in smeared snot and tears.
My name is Callum, and I'm going to be everybody's bodyguard. But you don't have to pay me, because I have lots of money already.
Miss Hammond stared at him, her mouth agog. And the children stared at him in confusion. But after a brief moment of silence, they started to fight and cry and play again. When it was Rebecca's turn to introduce herself, nobody paid her any attention at all. She glanced around and spoke in a clear voice.
Hello, my name is Rebecca, and I want to make friends.
Then, she took out the folded paper airplane from her pocket and threw it at the little boy at the back of the room who was crying the loudest. Rebecca's actions surprised everyone so much that they all stopped what they were doing and looked at the little boy who had been hit by the paper plane. The plane naturally hadn't hurt him, but it was enough to make him temporarily stop crying. He stared at Rebecca and then looked down at the paper plane on the ground.
It's for you,
Rebecca said.
Stop crying. It's too noisy.
Then she returned to her seat. She had stopped crying. She couldn't understand why everyone else couldn't do the same. Miss Hammond had watched the event unfold and was astonished at the actions of all three of the Davis triplets. After a moment's hesitation, she resumed the introductions and invited the next child out. A little girl, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, walked tentatively to the front of the room. Her eyes were big and wide, and she had clearly been crying for some time.
My name is Madeline,
she said so quietly that Miss Hammond could hardly hear her.
I'm 2 3/4. My brother is in the big school. His name is Riley.
Rebecca looked at the girl and decided she wanted to make friends with her. She folded another piece of paper into the shape of a plane to give it to her later. Next up was Beau. He still had the 2 gold star stickers attached to his cheeks, and some of the children giggled. He beamed at the attention.
My name is Beau. My brother is Luke. We are twins, so we look the same. But he doesn't say much. Callum and Tristan are my cousins, and my mommy is best friends with their mommy, and Rebecca is their sister, so she's my cousin too.
He paused to catch his breath.
I like to play with toys. My favorite is my toy camera. I help my mommy take pictures sometimes. My daddy says my mommy's pictures are really good. I want to take pictures like her when I'm older.
He paused to take another breath, and Miss Hammond considered stopping him there, but he had the attention of most of the other kids, so she let him continue.
I also like to draw and watch movies. My favorite movie is Toy Tales. I like Windy the best, but I also like Pink Shadow Man.
Bo didn't seem to care that 1 or 2 children were still sobbing in the back of the classroom. He glanced at one boy who was wiping snot onto his t-shirt and then carried on talking.
I think that's all for now. But if you have any questions, just come to me and ask.
Bo returned to his seat with a huge smile on his face. Rebecca clapped loudly, and some of the other children joined in. Callum stood up and drummed his hands on the table. He jumped up and down exuberantly, making as much noise as he could. Bo was more than satisfied with the reaction to his speech, and he beamed at his classmates. The 2 teachers grimaced at each other, and each knew what the other was thinking, that they would have their work cut out with that group of children. Miss Hammond then turned to Luke to go up to introduce himself. Bo's twin walked tentatively to the front of the class. He was dressed similarly to Tristan in a shirt and long pants. He glanced uncomfortably at his classmates. He looked like a child who found it difficult to make friends. He said simply, "Luke." Then he went back to his seat without waiting for his teacher's comment. The 2 teachers looked at each other with astonishment. Bo and Luke were twin boys who looked identical, yet their personalities were poles apart. They shrugged and marveled at the mystery of genetics. After that, more students introduced themselves until there were only a couple left. But because they were clearly finding the experience of being in school so traumatic, Miss Hammond decided not to push them. Just then, another little boy entered the classroom late. He put down his school bag, and Miss Hammond invited him up to the front. He went confidently. He stood at the front of the class and looked around at the other faces looking back at him. He had a mischievous look on his face, and he clearly had no problem being separated from his parents.
Am I in trouble for being late, miss?
Today is the first day of school, and I've asked everyone to tell us their name and a little bit about themselves. The little boy grinned.
My name is Jose, and I like fighting. If you want to see how good I am, I can show you after class.
Miss Hammond stared at Jose in shock. Oh my, I can see this is going to be a tough year. It was time to start teaching, but since it was day 1 and the room was quite unsettled, she thought it would be better to let the kids do some painting to help relax them. She handed each one a paintbrush, a palette of paints, and some paper, and told them to paint anything they liked. Tristan was the first to start, and within a couple minutes, he had painted a robot. Then, he took out a small model robot from his bag and started to pull it apart. Beside him, Callum drew a car and carefully painted it. It was rare for him to be so studious. Rebecca painted a picture of her airplane. When it was done, it looked like something from a science fiction movie. Behind her, Bo had completed several different paintings. He enjoyed painting stick figure pictures of people. One of them was Miss Hammond, another was of the other teacher, and the third was of the little girl sitting beside him. Luke had painted a picture of a house, and it was quite detailed, with curtains in the windows and a path leading up to the front door. But there were no people in his painting. Just then, someone burst into tears, and everyone turned to look. In the back row, a little boy had tried to take Jose's painting and had received a punch in return.